places like Dubuque, Fort Madison, and St. Louis. When the paddle boats returned, they were full of supplies for the company's store in the woods operations. As the nation expanded out onto the treeless plains, there was a huge market for wood. Knapp Stout would take orders for whole bridges made to specifications, and much of their wood was made into lath and shingles for places like the Dodge House in Dodge City, Kansas. One of the four men responsible for company operations was John Knapp. He was from Fort Madison, Iowa, and was a buyer and traveler for the company. Mr. Knapp and William Wilson were the original owners. Wilson was burdened with considerable debt, but eventually became manager of the company's extensive Menominee operations. And Andrew Tanner, who we've already seen, as a young man, eventually owned a horse farm, which included the present-day Tanner School south to Lehman's and westward across the Cedar Mall, Walmart, and the college grounds. Rice Lake was his favorite town, and he was known to almost everyone who lived here before 1900. Henry Stout, shown here to the left of Mr. Tanner, was a professional financier and five-term mayor of Dubuque. He saved the company from probable bankruptcy in 1859. Two men working with axes would cut the trees. Saws were introduced in 1869 and used increasingly after that date. Swampers would clear trails so that a teamster with horses could drag the logs to a point where they could be loaded onto a sleigh. The Knapp Stout Company cut mostly white pine, which could easily be floated downstream to the company mills. This load was cut in the Rice Lake area. Large log jams were common and were very dangerous to break apart. Log drivers drove these logs downriver, and they had this song: "I want to be a driver, and with a driver stand, a peavy on my shoulder, a knapsack in my hand. And there before old Tanner, so glorious in the light, I'd break the biggest log jams and drive both day and night." And can you see the people in this picture? They're down at the lower left. Let's zero in on them. Now they're in the center, and you can see that the logs are much bigger than they are. In the lumber camps, the kitchen was very important because unless the food was good, morale and production would fall. At least half to three-quarters of the people who came here in the early 1870s were from Menominee, which was the Knapp Stout Company headquarters. The company had special stationery for Menominee and Rice Lake, and by 1875 to 80 was said to be the world's largest lumber company in terms of production. They issued their own script as money until the federal government made them stop, and they paid $1.5 million in taxes to the state and paid all their city taxes in cash every January. Up until about 1890, the lumber industry provided well over half of all the city's income. The general store in Menominee became the biggest between here and the West Coast. A very similar Rice Lake store was located just south of the dam. Stagecoaches were operated steadily in those days, and there was an all-day daily run from Menominee to Rice Lake. They carried supplies, and loggers used them while hunting for jobs. They also carried mail and used 3 teams of horses on each run, with horse exchanges at 2 way stations. The route followed the Red Cedar River, since the Knapp Stout Company owned all the land on both sides. Every community had livery stables where horses could be rented or left for about a dime a day. There were small lumber camps dotted all over the map, such as this one near Brill. The Ojibwas were stunned and bewildered by the advancing loggers. They had sold their land under treaty in 1837, but had no real idea of what they were signing. They quickly adapted to the new clothing, and most had moved northeast to the Coudray River drainage by 1890. Some stayed and worked for the lumber companies, such as this Knapstout employee. As places were logged off, Knapstout would sell the land to loggers who were potential farmers. Often land that was purchased for 50 cents an acre would sell for $2 or more after being logged. Our oldest Rice Lake photo dates from 1884 and shows Christian Ogilvy's General Store, looking southeast from Main and Eau Claire Street. It was typical of the early Main Street buildings to be wooden with prominent lower windows, fancy upstairs windows, and an ornate cornice on top of the front wall. Bruce Ward saved an 1888 plat book that shows that Rice Lake Lumber Company had taken over much of the Knapstout grounds in Rice Lake. The two of them still owned what is now the whole city center, including the dam and the lands on both sides. Notice the sawmill and flour mill adjacent to the dam. And here is a little closer view of the two of them, where you can see the dam and also some of the Knapstout buildings to the south. Main Street looking south from Marshall Street in 1889 showed a healthy 2-year-old city, but one still very dependent on the wood industry. The old Field Merchandise store on the right was built in 1885 and may be the downtown's oldest structure today. On July 4th, 1889, there was a big celebration on the centennial of George Washington's presidency and the birth of the United States. We are looking north from Messenger Street and can easily see the Civil War vets marching in the foreground. They included Ebenezer Bassett, who fired the Union's first shot at the Battle of Gettysburg and who lived here until 1923. A special feature of the parade was the Goddess of Liberty float, pulled by 4 oxen with 13 young ladies, each dressed in red, white, and blue, and each representing one of the 13 original colonies. Here's a little closer view. Although the picture is fuzzy, we can just see the float in the center there. A closer view of the front of the parade shows the Rice Lake Cornet Band, the vets, and the Mannheim Flour and Feed Mill store to the rear, where the Ringling family, later of circus fame, had once honed its entertainment skills in the upstairs opera house. After 30 years of almost continuous conflict, the nation was calming down and the gay 90s were about to begin. Mr. Mannheim, by the way, was the city's only Confederate veteran and is buried in Norris Cemetery. The cornet band had at least 4 cornets, and the clean-shaven faces mean that this undated photo was taken after 1892. The band played frequently at the Opera House and at parades, which usually ended on Park Point. This was a scenic point of land north of the dam where the band had a small building which could be used for rainy day concerts. At about that same time, a photo was taken of the old flour mill, which was at the south edge of the dam. Farmers would line up there on Saturday afternoons to have their grains ground into flour. At one time, there were 5 big grindstones within that building, which were turned by the power of the water going through the dam. This 5-story building was 85 feet high and provided a great view in all directions for people that had no airplanes. Notice the 2 roofed balconies. We'll soon see some photos from up there. And this building burned to the ground in 1910. Andrew Taylor, center rear, and Jim Bracklin, center front, were very well known in the late 1890s as the Knapstout Company was closing out its businesses here. Mr. Bracklin at one time supervised Knapstout's 500 employees in the Rice Lake area and was later mayor for 3 terms. Mr. Taylor died here in 1899, Mr. Bracklin in 1900, and their accomplishments were legendary and were in some way a part of almost every structure in the city. Knapstout's last log drive went over the dam and downriver in 1900 as the company stopped its operations here. Henry Stout is seen at the far right front with his son Frank D. Stout just behind. Frank Stout is known for the Stout Island estate on Red Cedar Lake. The islands were actually acquired by Mrs. Effie Knapp in 1879 for less than $2. Henry Stout's other son James is sitting at the left and was the founder of Stout Institute. The Stouts, Knapps, as well as Mr. Taylor gave generously to charities, and Frank Stout left a $25 million estate when he died in 1927. Let's take a brief look around town in 1897. No building was over 30 years old, and many were classics of style of that period. The South Side School is a good example. Christmas 1896 looked like this at the M.T. Howard residence, which later burned and then became the site of the Lakeside Hospital on North Main Street. The area between the lake and the fairgrounds was known as Howard's Point. In 1897, Mr. Howard had a thriving hardware business at the southeast corner of Main and Newton Streets. And fishing in Rice Lake was fantastic in those years, and Mr. Howard pulled a 20-pound muskie from the lake in 1887. The Rice Lake Brewery turned out 9,000 barrels of beer in 1896, and most of it was consumed locally. It was on East Allen Street. The Rice Lake Manufacturing Company was on West Eau Claire Street and turned out interior fixtures, and these were wooden fixtures. It also specialized in building depots for the Sioux Line Railroad, which came here in 1899. The Bank of Rice Lake was at the southwest corner of Main and Eau Claire Streets by 1892 and later became the First National and First Wisconsin and is now First Star. It was the only bank on Main Street to wholly survive the Great Depression years with all deposits intact and has been at the same location longer than any other Rice Lake business. In 1897, the bank also housed Sewell Peterson's clothing store, which is visible at the left under the awning. Mr. Peterson, who was very active in city politics, built a beautiful residence which still stands at 12 West Newton Street. He was Rice Lake's mayor for one term and later was treasurer of the state of Wisconsin. The P.M. Parker General Store on Main Street was grossing $100,000 a year by 1896. The Opera House above could seat 1,000 people and was used for high school events, picture shows, church services, dances, boxing and wrestling matches, as well as plays, operas, and other gatherings. And this building was remodeled to 3 stories in 1913 and still stands at 218 North Main as Main Street's biggest building, now Osterbauer Drugs. Mr. and Mrs. Parker were models of the late 1890s styles. A vest and a shirt with a wingtip collar and short hair with a mustache were common combinations for men after 1892. And virtually all of the women had long hair pinned up or pinned back, and their skirts nearly touched the floor. Styles were more lighthearted for children, although almost everyone wore boot-like shoes. And these kids probably never tasted a hamburger, French fries, or a chocolate sundae. Dr. Toussaint Sharon became mayor in 1897 and was also a pioneer farmer of the area. His knowledge and skills as a doctor saved many lives, and he made calls to rural areas at a time when there were many serious accidents involving manual labor. And in addition, smallpox, diphtheria, and scarlet fever were very serious diseases, especially for children. Dr. Sharon also had built a very nice home with an open porch and a balcony near the downtown, and notice the fence. The city had hundreds of roaming dogs as well as loose cattle, horses, and chickens. C.M. Myers had a barber shop at 105 North Main and noticed a sign, bathrooms. There were very few indoor toilets then, and a bathroom was only for taking a bath. They were often used by lumberjacks, and in summertime there was a city bathhouse under the Main Street Bridge. Putro and Boddington had a bicycle business on Main Street in 1896, and bicycles were a major form of transportation then. They were selling for $75 each as late as 1890, and there were only a few in the city. By 1896, the price was down to $20, and bicycles were common. And notice the latest fashion in hats. William Cruz had a grocery store at Wilson Avenue and Eau Claire Street, and it later was known as the Roosevelt Tavern, the House of Truth, and it's now the Edelweiss Inn. Clara Duvalier had a restaurant on the east side of Main Street about halfway between Marshall and Humbird Streets. It was very popular for seafood specialties. Miss Duvalier also catered food for all sorts of meetings and assemblies. The Deary House at the northeast corner of Main and Messenger was the classiest hotel between Eau Claire and Superior. It was later destroyed by fire. And our thanks go to Clara Dunn for saving these priceless old photos. This brings us up to 1900 as 3,000 Rice-like people faced the new problems and opportunities of the 20th century, and they were well prepared. A smooth street and a well-planned uptown or downtown served a variety of small businesses, plus a growing number of area farms and the still thriving lumber business of the Rice Lake Lumber Company, which dealt mainly in hardwoods. There was a daily run of 4 trains and an improving road network of dirt roads leading from the city. Rice Lake's business district had electricity and hot water heat, along with a system of water mains from a flowing well at the dam. As an aside, the old Ringling harness business at the southwest corner of Main and Newton had moved to Baraboo in 1889, although the building was still there. The Ringling circus shows appeared here many times in the decades to follow. August Ringling Sr. was the father of the 7 brothers and planned to return to Rice Lake to retire in 1891. By 1929, John Ringling, seated at the far right, had accumulated a $50 million estate. And here is a 1904 view of Main Street from the old flour mill just south of the bridge. The board sidewalks were usually made of hemlock or white pine. The big building at the upper left was serving as a high school and library after having been built by the city and napsed out as a courthouse in 1890. When the county seat did not come here, the building also became a city hall until 1902. Another view to the northwest shows the city skyline and the Red Cedar River Manufacturing Company in the foreground, now Rice Lake Coffee House. The students were taught then that we as a nation would be all out of wood by 1926. And later, by the early 1920s, teachers said we would soon run out of coal, just as the recent generation thought we would run out of oil. Those people had about 100 telephones, and the fear was they would put the post office out of business. A third view completes the scenery to the north. The old knapstout sawmill is in the foreground, and the 2-year-old City Hall is visible in the upper center. That building was predicted to last 1 generation and is still in use 93 years later. On July 4th, 1904, there was a large parade which featured some of the military reserve units. The early 1900s were exciting times as many new businesses came to Main Street and other parts of the city. Autos or horseless carriages such as the Briscoe were starting to replace the horse and buggy, and they had wooden frames, axles, and spokes, and would often catch a fire due to friction. Up until about 1920, autos were used only in the warmer months and were generally stored during the winter. Barney Droop came here from Russia in 1901 and soon established a business, shown at the far left, which featured Russian frost ice cream along with other foods and candies. It was a real favorite of the young people. Mr. Droop built a new building at 6 North Main Street in 1914, and it still says Droop's there on the Wetzel Appliance Store. The Presbyterian Church on West Messenger was built by European craftsmen in 1893, where it stood as a beautiful, inspirational place of worship for more than 50 years. It has since been remodeled to meet modern standards of access, lighting, and space. The structure next to it has already been mentioned as the old library, City Hall, and High School. Beginning in 1906, it became known as Barron County Normal School. It graduated its first class of 8 trained teachers in 1908, and this may be a later class. The building was demolished in 1963 to make way for a parking lot. The Washington High School was constructed for $32,000 in 1905 and 6 on South Wilson Avenue and served thousands of students for the next 50 years, but eventually was destroyed to make way for a new telephone building. In 1907, Rice Lake still had a frontier-like dirt street, and there had been a shootout in front of Charbellic's old 88 Saloon at 130 North Main only 4 years earlier, now the Blue Hills Bookseller. Drivers of horses would often forget to tie them to a hitching post, and the result was sometimes wild, uncontrolled runs if the animals were frightened by a passing car. The 1908 fire department was almost all volunteers and had a running team, but with nobody identified here. Parades were big attractions in the days before radio and television, and they tended to be long and colorful. If you look carefully, you can see the new Carnegie Library at the far left. It was completed in 1905 with a $10,000 grant from the Carnegie Foundation. The white building just to the right of the library was the old county courthouse before the county seat was moved to Barron in 1874. From then until 1890, this structure at the northwest corner of Main and Messenger would be the City Hall. The city received its charter in April of 1887. The old Main Street was 8 feet wider than the one we have now. Just before curbs were installed in 1912, it was decided to widen the sidewalks from 12 to 16 feet. Nick Heinz was a Main Street pharmacist from 1889 to 1949, and his 1908 store was at 205 North Main. Upstairs, Dr. Dunn, who specialized in artificial teeth for $10, had an office. He was the city's first resident dentist and was postmaster from 1916 to 24. The Triumphal Arch was put up in 1879 as a welcome for new residents who often arrived in covered wagons, also called prairie schooners. The arch was removed in 1909. By 1908, the Main Street buildings were a mixture of wood and brick. Several disastrous fires had occurred, and all newer buildings were made of non-combustible materials. Part of the old Mapstout lumber mill was apparent on the skyline. The Rice Lake Lumber Company began to buy the Mapstout Company facilities in 1883, and by 1908, they had also recovered over 10,000 sunken logs from the lake bottom. Their extensive processing operations could be clearly seen from the flour mill balcony, and the foreground building is still standing. Another part of the wood processing can be seen looking northeast from Allen Street and the railroad tracks. Up until 1900, all sawdust was dumped into the river. And not shown here but nearby is the Excelsior Mill, which would become the world's largest in the early 1920s. At the northeast corner of Allen and Main Street, Rice Lake Lumber built themselves a new office in 1890. And by 1924, their Rice Lake hardwood mill was said to be the largest in the world. From the roof, one could see extensive pallets of finished wood awaiting transport and drying in the sun. Much of this is now the Marketplace Foods parking lot and store. People worked 10 hours a day then, 6 days a week, and many in very heavy manual labor. Motion pictures started to show up in the early 1900s, like the Gem Theater at 110 North Main, which was the site of the original Opera House. These were silent pictures, and the manager had to hire crews to produce music and other sounds to match the mood of what showed on the screen. We owe thanks to many of these old photos to Hamilton Photography. Mr. Hamilton had a studio on North Main from 1907 to 1909. Lakeshore Drive through the park was a wagon road then. The 3-acre park was donated to the city by Knapp Stout in 1901 and was at first called Lakeside Park. But since it was the only real park here, it became known as City Park. Civic clubs and volunteer labor gradually built up the park to a place of quiet relaxation for the community. By 1909, all streets leading off Main were still narrow and dusty. The old boardwalks had been subject to breakage and would often catch fire in dry spells. So in June of that year, it was decided that all new sidewalks would be made of cement. And in addition, sewer pipes were put in all over the city to drain all the sewage into the river. We're looking straight east here on Messenger Street from the railroad tracks. On August 24th, 1910, a terrific hailstorm hit northern Barron County with stones up to 7.5 inches in diameter. Almost every north or west-facing window in Rice Lake was broken, including 33 in the new high school. Many dogs and cats were killed and farm animals, and some people had serious injuries. In 1906 and 7, Rice Lake pioneer native John Dietz made nationwide headlines as he defied the Weyerhaeuser Company in a dispute over the transportation of logs across his property east of Winter, Wisconsin. Eventually, he won the battle and received a $1,717 settlement, which is equal to $24,000 in today's inflated dollar. In 1910, he was involved in a shooting over a school board matter and spent 9 years in Waupun as a result. The Hammond Lumber Company sold fuel and lumber and built many nice houses in Rice Lake between 1906 and 16. Mr. Hammond platted part of the North Rice Lake and sold lots on Crate, Wilson, and Hammond Avenues. His main yards were on both sides of Knapp Street and just west of the railroad. Some of the men in the early logging and crane crews were known for feats of strength, and one of those was Clam Peterson, far right in this 1911 photo. At one point in the 1930s, the police chief jailed Clam for excessive drinking and then met him on Main Street an hour later. "Who let you out?" the chief said, and Clam said he let himself out by ripping the hot water radiator off the wall and using it as a wedge to pry the cell window bars apart enough so he could squeeze his way out. Family photos of early Rice Lake people were often completely on label, leaving us to guess at the time and place, although we do know this was a Barta family and friends. In the days before 1918, people conformed to certain standards of dress and hairstyle with much less diversity than today. In 1911, Rice Lake residents were very proud of their new library at the right, the Normal School Center, and you can just see the Presbyterian Church between the two. Jess Coleman's blacksmith shop is at the far left in the northwest corner of Main and Highland. The Red Cedar Valley Electric Company was generating electric power at the dam in 1911, and power lines had been extended to most of the city. To the right rear, a large building is visible. That's the canning factory. The factory was constructed in 1907, and by 1911 it was the largest pea canning factory in the world and could turn out 124,000 cans of peas in one day. The canning factory site is now occupied by another world-class company, Birchwood Manufacturing. Main Street in 1911 could be money for a parade, but the little fellow in front doesn't care. He will keep time with them anyway. On the other side of Main, we can get an idea of what people were wearing in 1912. It looks like they are all in their Sunday best. The tourist hotel was on the northwest corner of Main and Humbert and dominated the Main Street skyline after 1892. From 1916 to 21, it was a Weber Hotel, and it had a great view of the lake and the Main Street from the upper floor. It was destroyed by fire in 1925. In the summer of 1912, the city moved all of its electric lines, poles, and hitching posts to the side streets and alleys, and everyone liked the new white way, as they called it, with clear, clean white globe lights. Horses still did a lot of the transport work, and notice the driver up by the sign. The co-op store at 234 North Main is now Bodis Jewelers. Here's another look at that same block. Canvas awnings were attached to almost every storefront. Main Street was finally paved in 1914, but there were still no stop signs, and autos tended to crash on corners and to travel on either side of the street with no set of rules. The Rice Lake City Band had a long tradition before 1940. In 1915, it posed at the City Hall with Oscar Overby, who later became known as Mr. Music, second from right. Horses and fire equipment were kept at or near the City Hall on the ground floor up to 1926. The mayor's office was on the second floor, and here Mayor Hines, seated, confers with Olis Norwick and Alderman Art Overby. The city had a commission form of government from 1912 to 22, and 3 men made all the decisions instead of the mayor-council. The county fairgrounds was used extensively and was extremely popular in the 1920s and 30s. These 1916 buildings have long since been torn down. Baseball was played every summer Sunday with over 1,000 people often in attendance. The players usually got a cut of the gate fee, and one Rice Lake native, Clayton Perry, was a star in the minor leagues and later returned here and had a .474 average at the age of 45 in 1925. The Chippewa Falls and Northern Railroad came here in 1882, and trains were a vital part of everyday life during the first half of the 20th century. The old Omaha Depot, which still stands on Tainer Avenue, was built in 1909, 1 block north of the original 1882 station. Many of the newcomers to Rice Lake who stepped out of the passenger cars here could barely speak a word of English. On the other hand, a number of area people were multilingual, and Carl Rose, a Rice Lake Lumber Company employee, could speak 7 languages. In January of 1919, the 5th grade in the North Side School had a photo taken. Many of the students were dressed up, so to speak, every day. This was the old Central School and the city's first high school and was torn down in 1927. The present-day Lincoln School replaced it. And the teacher here, Miss Duffner, had a long career and is still remembered by many of her former students. The city voted itself dry in 1916, and this put all of Main Street's saloons out of business, although some managed to survive as restaurants or billiard parlors. Liquor and beer became legal again in April of 1933 in the very depths of the Great Depression, and the saloons were reopened as taverns. Some early photos are labeled, such as this one at 26 Reuter Avenue in 1918, looking east. The Washington High School is visible behind the lady, as is the Ashland Woodworking Company. Henry Ashland had by that time built a good many houses in the city. And this was the year that Spanish influenza killed 10 million people worldwide. And the people here were so scared that all the schools, churches, and theaters were closed and all public assemblies were banned for a month that fall. In 1919, there was a terrible recession and downturn in the economy, and interest rates went sky high. Little did those people know that rates would not get that high again until 1946. Brighter times were ahead, and people were humming and whistling the Missouri Waltz in beautiful Ohio when 12 local investors decided to build a dance pavilion on North Wilson Avenue. It opened in June of 1919 and was an immediate sensation. Construction was done by Cyril Mercer of Rice Lake, and the Hop Ogilvy Band was in big demand. Only 1 month later, the Isle of Pines Dance Pavilion opened. This screened-in building was on an island just a half-mile upstream from where the river empties into Rice Lake. For the next 20 years, it was very high on the popularity list for Rice Lake people, young and old. Many people walked or bicycled there from the city, and appropriately, the Isle of Sweethearts Waltz was popular then. Others took the launch boat from City Park. It was 15 cents for a round trip. In the fall of 1920, Leah Fritz joined the high school faculty to teach botany and history. Over the next 35 years, she taught mostly history and was a very respected teacher. She would tell the ground rules the first day, and everyone lived by them. In 1921, the second semester freshmen posed for a photo on the library steps. Clothing styles were dark and formal, with fur items very popular, and every person had a hat or a cap. Those students had no school buses, and many walked long distances to school. World War I had been a very difficult time for Main Street, as some Rice Lake industries were shut down, and gasoline use was limited, and sugar was rationed at 2 pounds a month per person. Still, the war had served to unify people and had dissolved many prejudices having to do with race and nationality. A new assembly line Ford was $300, and breakfast cereal was $1 a box. In this 1925 scene, we can see Glenn Honeyman's dime store far left and Jacobson's bowling alley and billiard parlor. The Florsheim shoe store on the First National Bank building was run by the Sockness brothers. The decade of the Roaring '20s started with a very serious recession and was filled with changes. Women cut off their long Victorian-style hair, and chain stores such as J.C. Penney and A&P came to Main Street. Flappers, moonshine, and the Teapot Dome scandal were on people's minds, and they were starting to hear about handheld cameras and electric refrigerators. The Jazz Age was ushered in by Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and George Gershwin. In March of 1919, the Consumer Store Company was incorporated as a successor to the Rice Lake Co-op store, which is visible at the right in this older photo. There were consumer stores in Rice Lake, Barron, and Hagen, and a great many area farmers were stockholders. In the spring of 1922, it went bankrupt and took with it nearly $400,000 of investor and creditor funds, which was a major blow to the downtown. Most houses still had fences, and at least 1/3 of all Rice Lake homes contained more than one generation of adults, and many had 3 generations. Parades were as popular as ever then, and notice Otto Shudlick's harness shop at the far right, now part of Henning's office supply. Mr. Shudlick ran the shop from 1906 to 50, and as late as 1911, the city had 418 wagons and sleighs, 344 horses, and 315 head of cattle. By the mid-20s, people had more time to read, and the 5.5-day work week came in, and the city library was in its heyday. This classic Colfax sandstone building was a never-to-be-forgotten work of art which stood as a Main Street landmark for over 80 years. The city slogan was Rice Lake Wide Awake, and the people had all kinds of good things going for them as the decade wore on. A new concrete bridge had been installed over the river in 1920 at a cost of $32,000. 2 previous bridges had been made of wood and 1 of iron. Another important bridge was near the Lakeview Park area, now known as the Narrows. And the drive around the lake's west side was still narrow and of a dirt base. You can see at least 1 shoreline residence and many boathouses. The city park and the band shell were host to thousands of visitors each summer. The old band shell was put up in 1920. That was the year women were empowered to vote, and Babe Ruth hit 54 home runs. In the early 1920s, all highways leading from the city were dirt, and usually they had terrible ruts and potholes in the spring. Since they tended to be worn lower by use, they suffered from poor drainage and very heavy drifting. And those were the days of superlative downtown Christmas decorations. Beginning in 1926, all of the work was financed by Kiwanis and Rotary, along with volunteer labor, except for Northern States Power and the Barron County telephone crews. They would cut 150 spruce and balsam trees to be placed in flagpole holes in the sidewalks. A large Christmas tree was placed in the center of Main Street until 1935, when it became too much of a traffic hazard. A Christmas Eve snowstorm with a south wind produced a winter wonderland in 1926. One could hardly ask for nicer downtown scenes than these. The Land O'Lakes Hotel, later King Edward Inn, was constructed in 1926, and this building has been a prominent Main Street fixture ever since. In 1928, Rice Lake had a big 60th anniversary parade with 10,000 spectators, and they're coming out of West Marshall Street since North Main was being concreted at that time. The parade started with 25 Ojibwas and then went into the fur trade, and at this point the logging days. And notice the covered wagon. President Coolidge's cousin Ernest was the driver, and President Coolidge was at his summer retreat on the Brule River. He was the only president ever to have 6 consecutive budget surpluses, and that fall Mayor Gustafson received a very complimentary letter from the president, who predicted a great future for Rice Lake. And let's zero in a little closer on the wagon driven by Ernest Coolidge. He had come down here from Yarnell near Birchwood, where he lived, and the sign says Rice Lake or Bust. And so the parade went on in an historical progression. The military Company D was in the parade too, and as a reserve unit, they had a mascot, a little 5-year-old boy with a full uniform his mother had made. And his name, Warren Leary, Jr. And Warren himself would soon be a combatant in World War II and a prisoner of war in Germany. And in 1928, the local congressman, James Freer, was predicting war in Europe within 10 years. We're very indebted to Norma Nelson for these two excellent photos. Earl Bartlett played the part of a 1900 flapper in the parade, and notice the word Jake to the right. Jake and John Lampert were in the lumber business here after 1923. Another parade about 1930 also had an historical theme. Notice the majestic theater at 214 North Main Street. It was built in 1920 and could seat almost 500 people. And during the 20s, Al Jolson, Clara Bow, and Tom Mix were big stars. George Miner owned the theater, and in 1929 he installed $8,000 worth of sound equipment. Before that, all Rice Lake movies were silent. In the late 1920s, there was a very happy and prosperous time for Rice Lake, and especially for the downtown, which was open late every Saturday evening. In summer, while they had no daylight savings time, they simply set their business hours forward 1 hour. But those happy times ended on Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, as the stock market went into a 4-day meltdown. Although the downtown did not notice these problems right away, some gray clouds were threatening the economy by the fall of 1930. And here we can see at the far left the building that housed the Chronotype offices and plant at 1 South Main Street. You can also see the normal school, the library, and high school, and the old Oddfellows building over to the right. Now beer cheese blooms. An important change took place that year when Schultz Brothers bought out Honeyman's Dime Store. These modern liberated ladies were doing their shopping at Schultz's. In 1919, Park Falls Lumber Company, owned by Edward Hines of Chicago, bought the Rice Lake Lumber Company property and operated the mills all through the 1920s. And here we can see Allen Street at the left. We're looking westward from above Rice Lake. The so-called Big Mill was at the far east end of Charles Street, behind what's now Marketplace Food. It closed in September of 1931 due to a lack of orders and never reopened. And so a 63-year era of large-scale logging and processing, which started in 1868, came to an end. And the entire mill was destroyed in a spectacular fire in June of 1934. Hines Lumber, as it became known, moved a considerable amount of equipment here from Park Falls between 1920 and 24, and also had a little mill located northwest of the big mill and just south of the dam. A tramway was used to move logs and boards between the two mills. Rice Lake Lumber and Hines Lumber employed from 100 to 300 men, depending on the economy and the time of year. Claire Christensen and Al Kronk provided these last two high-quality photos. There were several ice carnivals in the early 1930s with 2,000 or more people in attendance between East Eau Claire and East Marshall Streets on the lakefront. The first radios arrived in the early 1920s and were thought to be the marvel of all the ages, the ultimate information superhighway, and having far-off voices come out of thin air and into homes seemed like a miracle. People would compare notes on which station they could receive, and by the late 1920s, radios were sold in several Rice Lake locations. In 1932, Francis Carney Standing bought out Joe Bieran's radio shop at 15 South Main Street. An airplane photo of the north side in 1932 clearly shows the fairgrounds where all the high school baseball, track, and football events were held. Also visible is the old dance pavilion where all kinds of southern bands played that summer. The Dixie Cotton Pickers, for example, advertised themselves as 10 snappy colored musicians. (1931, 2, and 3 were very difficult years on Main Street as the economy contracted steadily under what is known as the Great Depression. There was 25% unemployment nationwide, and city employees and school teachers took a voluntary 10% pay cut. There was a rash of thefts and break-ins as people struggled to survive, and depositors pounded on the doors and windows of defunct banks to demand their money, but many lost a whole lifetime of savings. And no one who lived through those years will ever forget the terrible toll they took on society. Interest rates fell to 0.5% on U.S. Treasury bills, and it was suggested that the schools be closed to save money, and a $10 bill would buy an old Model T Ford. The 1930s decade was a rough one even for those who managed to keep their jobs. The economic problems were made worse by severe drops in 1934 and 36 when clouds of dust would occasionally sweep over the city from the plains. 1936 saw a record 7-week cold spell with 35 straight below zero mornings in January and February, with a low of -48 here and -52 in Cumberland, which is still the state record for February. Then, only 5 months later, temperatures skyrocketed to 110 degrees, and the lake heated to 80 degrees. Somehow the people endured it all through sheer grit and determination, and many with their money kept in mattresses and mason jars. Rice Lake had a hockey team then, which featured the 4 Paul brothers. The lake was used for skating until a snowplow broke through in the late 30s, and the rink was moved to what is now the Chamber of Commerce parking lot in 1939. In February of 1933, the Rice Lake Lakers won their district games at Spooner and went on to the state tournament at Madison. Chet Christensen, second from right and rear, was the leading scorer, and Chet had the distinction of being class president for 3 of his 4 high school years and was salutatorian of his 1934 class when his team won all 13 of its conference games. By 1934, the center of the city had filled in completely. Notice the L-shaped building on the lower left. Horses could be left there while shoppers did business on Main Street. This is in the 100 block of South Main at the Chamber of Commerce parking lot now. Cars, trucks, and tractors, though, were taking over for horses, and the stable was removed in 1935. The Rice Lake High School had a main room or assembly room study hall which could seat all of the students for special programs, and many a grad will remember scenes like this. The Fair Store operated successfully at 25 North Main Street all through the 1930s and sold everything from clothing to groceries. Harold Champson, one of the owners, would give away cigars at the front door during certain promotions, and there were all-day suckers for the kids. Oliver Chevrolet became Johnson Chevrolet on East Eau Claire Street and is now Don Johnson Motors up on the hill. A retaining wall at the library was a popular place to watch traffic and while away the hours during the summer months. The bathhouse and the bathing beach at the foot of East Eau Claire Street have been used since 1909. Summer 1938, and these young people were dancing to the strains of Stardust and Moonlight Serenade. These were the swinging years when the music of the big band soothed the frayed nerves of millions of people. Jack Molitor had leased the old dance pavilion in 1928 and changed the name to the Rainbow Gardens. Dancers and skaters enjoyed the music and the big revolving colored globe above, and it seemed like almost everyone attended the 4th of July sunrise dance. Rice Lake had a city band from the 1880s to 1940, and here in 1939 they're in one of their last appearances. The Rice Lake Creamery had become an outstanding business by 1939. It produced butter, ice cream, and milk for consumers and was a source of ready income for farmers. It was owned by the Gerlin family, and by 1950 was the largest family-owned creamery in the world. There was a Demolay Ball in 1941, and a committee was formed to be in charge, which included Jack Thomas, lower right. Jack went on to become a very popular and effective teacher at Rice Lake High and had a phenomenal memory for names. And Jack scored a 230-yard hole-in-one that year at the Highdale Golf Course west of Rice Lake. Little did the people at the 1941 junior prom realize they would all soon be embroiled in World War II. A few of those shown are Carl Rennesbacher, Bernie Olson, Ruth Forbes, Gene Jacobson, and Leona Secor. And notice the little fellow in back, third from left. He graduated in 1943 and became the much bigger and friendly fellow of the downtown over the next 50 years. He is Bob Johnson. Summer 1944. The Breezy Point rental cabins were where Hokie West Noodle Potato Company is now, and it's a vast understatement to say that World War II was on everyone's mind. By 1946, returning veterans of the war found a healthy Main Street and over 5,500 people in the city. Norman Anderson, who was official city photographer for 45 years, took many of these fine photos. The downtown reached an architectural peak in the late 1940s when almost all the buildings had a consistent and stylish appearance. The present-day Main Street Board and Association hopes many building fronts can be returned to this general appearance over a period of time. The boulevards in Rice Lake were refined during the labor-intensive 1930s by Civilian Conservation Corps workers in a very outstanding way. And the present Tree Advisory Board is urging people to plant more side boulevard trees under Park Board guidelines. In May of 1946, the sixth graders at Jefferson School posed for a photo. As of 1995, some of the students, such as Marilyn Longseth, Janet Nelson, and Argel Dietz, still live in Rice Lake. In the rear is Willard Swanson, a teacher. He was on the school faculty by 1938 and later became high school principal. And he, along with Mr. Lewis King, did a very effective job of administering the school system over the next 3 decades. In the late 1940s, there was a toboggan slide on the Zimmerman farm just west of the city near what is now the Evergreen Motel. It was used by young and old alike. By 1948, the Buckhorn Tavern on North Main was probably the most memorable of all Rice Lake businesses of that time. Now a part of Smith's Furniture Store, it was filled with trophies, many of which were local donations. One of these was a world record 103-point buck shot by Homer Pearson in 1937 about 10 miles northwest of Cumberland. The Wisconsin State Historical Society verified that 103 points were at least 3/8 of an inch long, and the Field Museum of Chicago made a bid for the deer. Then Vice President Garner wrote to Mr. Pearson for details, and a Pennsylvania doctor offered $500 for the animal. But it was predictable that eventually the head would find its way into the Buckhorn under the care of co-owner John Renlisbacher. By the summer of 1950, Rice Lake was a prosperous and well-developed city. Most of the heavy manual labor was over, and the mental stresses of the Depression and World War II were in the past. Now let's look at some scenes over the past 40 years. Maybe some of them will be familiar to you.